Today I'll be reading Genesis chapter 22, 10 through 12. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from the heavens, "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because have not withheld from me your son, your only son."
There are truths that I know and that I accept intellectually, but even with unquestioning acceptance, some of those truths still stagger my imagination. All of us know what a fingerprint is, and all of us know that each one of us has a set of fingerprints. And all of us know that each set of fingerprints is distinctive. No two people's fingerprints are identical. Fingerprints are so distinctive, so unique, that you can be found and identified by your fingerprints no matter where you are in this world. That staggers my imagination, that so many people could have so many variations just on your fingers, just in that fingerprint. You know, as we think about that, we realize that if our fingerprints are on something, that is our work. That has been in our hands. God has fingerprints, and His fingerprints are also distinctive, and anyone can learn to recognize God's fingerprints. The sure way to learn to recognize God's fingerprints is to learn to correctly identify God's work in your life. Commonly, we learn to identify God's fingerprints by looking at past experiences and seeing how God was at work within us and around us. It is by seeing God's fingerprints and His past work in our lives that gives us greater faith today that He is still working and still caring for each one of us. You know, one night, God directed Abraham to take his son. To take that son that God had promised him, that son that he had waited 25 years to receive, the son of promise. He wanted him to take him and put him up on an altar and kill him in a sacrifice to God. As a parent, and anyone in here that is a parent, that's a hard thing to imagine, isn't it? We think about the things that God has commanded us to do, and I'm thankful that this is not one of them ever. But God did command Abraham to do so. And Abraham got up early that next morning. You know, he didn't think about it for a few days as to whether he was going to obey God. He got up early that next morning from the time that God told him, and he began to prepare for a journey. He gathered the wood. He got his son. He got some men to go with him. He prepared the fire and all that he needed to make the sacrifice quickly. He took 2 young servants with him to assist him in making the journey as fast as possible. And because at that time Abraham was quite old, he also rode a donkey to make certain that he could complete the journey that God had commanded him to make. And as he neared the site of the sacrifice, he told the young servants that came with him to stay behind so that they would not interfere. Because certainly upon seeing him trying to kill his son, they may think that old Abraham finally has lost it, right? So they stay behind. But I want you to think about something too. The journey from where Abraham was to Mount Moriah, where he was to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, that was a 3-day journey. That was 3 days that Abraham traveled, thinking about the fact that he was traveling to kill his son. And how difficult that had to be on him. At the place that God designated for Abraham to offer that sacrifice, Abraham built an altar, placed Isaac upon it, and would have killed him had he not been stopped by that angel. The angel said to him, "I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Why was Abraham so ready? Why was Abraham so willing to put his precious son of promise upon an altar and slit his neck to offer him as he had been commanded? Why would he be willing to do that? The son that he had waited 25 years for, a son that he's now had in his life for more than 20 years. And now he's going to sacrifice him. How do you get there? How do you make that kind of decision? I think that he could look back. I think that he could look back from the time that he was 75 years old when we see him enter into the biblical picture. And I think Abraham could look back and see the fingerprints of God all over his life. He could see God's fingerprints during the 25 years that he waited for God to give him Isaac, even when he laughed and Sarah laughed at the idea of having this promised son. He looked back and saw how God repeatedly had done the impossible in his life. Hebrews chapter 11 gives us a little bit of insight, doesn't it, as to what he was thinking? Because even as he was willing to sacrifice his son, he believed that God could bring him back and return him to him. But it was still a great faith, and that's why he makes that chapter of faith. A faith in God. He saw God's fingerprints on his past, and he did not hesitate to entrust his present to the hands of God again, even with the life of his own son. You know, I think if ever a teenager experienced the best and the worst of life, it would have to be Joseph, wouldn't it? Beginning in Genesis 37. Of Jacob's 12 sons, Joseph was the favorite. That's never a good idea in any family for a parent to have a favorite, but unfortunately, that seemed to have been a long shadow of bad mistakes by parents in that family line. Isaac, Abraham, all of them. They had their favorites and it caused problems. But he was the favorite because he was the son of Rachel. And because of that favoritism and because of all that his father did for him and gave to him in exclusion to his brothers, we just have to say that when Joseph was at home and when we first see him enter the story, he's a little bit of an arrogant brat. Not to put too fine a point on it. But he was. I think we'd all want to throw him in a pit if he was running around our households saying the things that he said. I mean, he even made his own father Jacob angry. Are you saying I'm going to bow to you one day? Well, he was. But maybe you don't always say everything that you might have dreamed the night before. But we see that he certainly had some issues at home. And it caused his brothers to hate him. And they hated him so much that when he came to them in the fields, they took him there in the wilderness and they put him in a pit. They were going to kill him. And had it not been for Reuben, his oldest brother, they would have. But in lieu of taking his life, they sold this son of a very rich man to Ishmaelite traders. And he would be taken down to Egypt. As a slave there, he grew up fast. But one thing that we see that somewhere between the days in which he was with his father in that pit and getting to Egypt, somewhere along the way, Joseph changes, doesn't he? And becomes a man of honor. He becomes a man who is trustworthy. He becomes a man that is a diligent worker. In Genesis 37, we see that he refuses the sexual advances of his owner's wife. And she was angered by his rejection and accused him of attempted rape. And as a result of her deception, the owner had really no choice but to put Joseph in the royal prison. But even in prison, he excelled because of the kind of person that he had become. And he was a model prisoner, and he was appointed a trustee, and he was so responsible and so trusted that they never did even check on him. They didn't watch what he was doing. They trusted him to do what he said that he would do. And he helped the king's cupbearer. And as he interpreted his dream and his return to the king's court. And he asked for just one thing for helping this man, for doing this favor for this man. He asked just one thing. When you go before Pharaoh, tell him about me. And that cupbearer, about the time he got out of the prison cell, had already forgotten about Joseph. Well, opportunity, though, came, as it does for God's people, as God opens doors. Opportunity came for Joseph to interpret the king's dreams, and as a result, the king made him the second most powerful ruler in all of Egypt. And in that position as a powerful ruler, he would save his father. He would save his brothers. He would save their families from starvation during a terrible famine. And he brought them all to Egypt. And he found them a place to stay. After his father died, his brothers are, going on in their mind. We threw him in a pit. We were going to kill him. And I'm sure the only reason he hasn't done anything to us, the only reason he hasn't killed us for that, because that's how they think, right? Get my vengeance. The only reason he hasn't is because of our father. He wouldn't want to break his heart. But now he's dead. And we're just sure that Joseph is now going to do what he's been waiting to do to get back at us, because that's how they think. But the problem is Joseph doesn't think like that. And he tells those men, Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about the present result to preserve many people alive. Let me tell you what that statement comes from. That statement comes from Joseph looking back and seeing God. Seeing the fingerprints of God on his life, even though his life wasn't always what we might want. What God did with his life and the fingerprints of God on his life brought him to that point to where he could not only save his father, but he could save his brothers, and he could save a lot of other people because of the person that he had become. God made a difference, and Joseph saw that. And even though his brothers did a terrible thing, when Joseph looked back, he saw God. He didn't see the evil of his brothers. It is relatively easy for Christians to look into the distant past and see God's fingerprints. For example, you and I can look back at Jesus' betrayals, the trials, and the execution on the cross and clearly see the fingerprints of God. God's fingerprints of the crucifixion should be so very obvious to us. And God was not only at work there, but He was doing His greatest work there at Golgotha. And we look at the cross and we see the fingerprints of God in forgiveness. We see the fingerprints of God in redemption, in justification, in propitiation, atonement. You and I owe every spiritual blessing that we have to God and the work that He did at the cross of Jesus Christ. Every Sunday morning we declare our faith in God's work through the cross by partaking of the Lord's Supper. We consciously reflect on what Jesus did that day by dying on the cross. We make a determination to remember what God did in sending Jesus and allowing Him to die there upon that cross. But you know, the believers who stood there that day with the sun darkened and Jesus hanging on a cross, they had a harder time seeing God's fingerprints than we do. All they saw was victory of evil. All they could see was evil winning. All they could see was that evil men had killed their Lord. They saw no divine plan. They could only see that the divine purpose has now been killed upon a cross. They couldn't see divine accomplishment. It is all too common to be unaware that God is at work when He's at work. But isn't that the way it always works? We look back at the arrogant, self-confident, take control Peter, and we see how God remolded his heart into that great servant. But when that was happening, it wasn't quite so apparent to Peter, was it? We look back at the murdering, blaspheming Saul, who hurt and destroyed men and women who placed their faith in Christ, and we see how God remolded his heart and his attitude and his purpose. And yet it would have been far more difficult for Paul to see it while it was going on. But we can look back and see those fingerprints ever so clearly in what he did. When I look back through my life, I see God's fingerprints in my life so clearly in so many situations. And I'm thankful for those fingerprints. They weren't always easy situations. They aren't always what I would have chosen. But like Joseph said, they were God's works and they were best. And I'm thankful for that. Can the people closest to you see God's fingerprints on your life? Can they see God's fingerprints on your heart, on your attitudes, on your emotions? Husband, can your wife see them? Parents, can your children see them? Wives, can your husband and your children see them? Children, can your parents see them in you? Christians, can your friends, your co-workers, your boss, your fellow students, your neighbors, can they see God's fingerprints on the life that you live every day? Because if God's fingerprints are there, you're God's work. Now there are places, right, that we despise seeing fingerprints. I put my glasses on a few days ago and I couldn't see anymore. They were supposed to help, but it's awfully hard to see through a big greasy fingerprint right in the center of your vision. So we don't like to see fingerprints on our glasses. We don't like to see them on our windows or on our mirrors, around light switches or counters, wherever it may be. There are many places that we should never want to see a fingerprint. But there is one place I want to see fingerprints and see them clearly. And the fingerprints that I want to see are fingerprints on my heart. And I want them to be God's fingerprints. And I never want God to stop molding me into who He wants me to be. I don't know how to make me into what I need to be, but God does. And I want Him to mold my heart and my life, to shape me. And when I let God mold my heart, the rest of my life will follow. I want my heart to be, remember Play-Doh. I loved Play-Doh. Just how soft it was, and you could just mold it and stuff. I want to be that fresh out of the can Play-Doh, not that kind that you've left over there for a while and it's gotten hard. I want to be that soft out of the can Play-Doh, and God to be able to shape it into whatever He wants my life to be. And I hope that that's the way you feel too. I want God to constantly shape my thoughts and my feelings and my emotions and my attitudes and my motives, my outlooks. I want God to be constantly touching my heart. And each time He touches my heart, I want Him to leave His fingerprints. Who's shaping your heart? There's only one of two people. Either God is shaping your heart or it's Satan is. And if your heart is hard, if it's unfeeling, if it's cold and judgmental, if it's lifeless and stiff, then Satan is shaping it. And his cruel fingerprints are all over it. But if it is soft and yielding, if it is kind and compassionate, if it is repentant and gracious, then God is shaping it. Who do you want to mold it? Whose fingerprints do you want to be on your heart? And do we realize what a mess we make with our lives when we try to mold our own hearts? Let God mold your heart today. If it doesn't have God's fingerprints on it, it needs them. And tonight we want to help you. We want to assist you. We want to assist in bringing you to the God that will mold your heart into the best that you could ever be. So that like Joseph, so that like Abraham, so that like so many other biblical characters that we could stand here and list tonight, you can look back over your life and you can say, this was about God. And it was for the good of everyone, including me. If we can assist you in bringing you to God and His fingerprints tonight, we don't pray that you will let us. Won't you come as we stand, as we sing?